Hi everyone. So I want to give you kind of an introduction to Module 3. We finished 2 and now we're going to start 3. In Module 2 we really talked about development, language development and the development of conversation, dialogue, communication. And we identified a goal for your students, and that was really based on the P levels as our developmental kind of guide. And so for this module, we really we're going to look at the standards. And the standards are the curriculum expectations for performance, student performance at various grade levels. And so we really want to kind of match what the developmental needs of the students are with the curriculum standards and the expectations for communication in classrooms and in school. So that's really the focus. The module is broken into two weeks. It's like we've done before, but week 1 and week 2 they're sort of different activities, and so it's easier to think about this module in two weeks, broken out like that. You do start with the launch, sort of the same as we've done before, and then the second, the explore is really, again, it's kind of broken up into 2 weeks. My notes are for Module 3 are for both weeks, and then I do give you an example kind of to look at. It sort of represents the goal that we want, what I'd like you to be able to do at the end of this module. And so sort of look at that, look at the example, and then as you're kind of doing some of the activities, you can go back to my example, and it might help you understand exactly what I want you to do. So week 1, we really kind of focus on 3 sets of standards, and you'll know some of these. The Common Core State Standards, and those you will, you'll get very familiar with these standards because most schools are really using the Common Core State Standards. The second set are the standards for very young children, and they are the Wisconsin Model Early Learning Standards. And those, if you're working in early childhood, or if you, again, are working with very young children, those are the appropriate standards for you to look at or to use, really, in helping you plan. The third set of standards are bilingual, and this group of standards are kind of new. They were built from the Common Core State Standards, so they're kind of aligned with the Common Core State Standards, but they focus on language and communication skills for bilingual learners, and so those are really kind of important if you want to really focus on very specific language skills. And so in week 1, you're really kind of analyzing, reading, analyzing, and becoming familiar with these sets of standards. And then week 2, you'll have week 1, you'll have an activity associated. The summarized activity will be based on week 1's readings. Then for week 2, you have additional readings that really kind of focus on intervention teaching. So there's a chapter in Easterbrook and Baker that really kind of focuses on answering and asking questions, and how that, you know, contributes to the conversation, and how important it is to be able to ask and answer questions in turn-taking a conversation. And then there are a few other readings that are really kind of focused on strategies for supporting and teaching conversation. So those readings are for week 2. Then the summarize associated with week 1. Let's go back to summarize. So in this week, you're really going to have an online dialogue where I have 2 questions really to help focus you. The first is, how are, just really understanding how each of the sets of standards are organized. What kind of categories, how are they set up, and how are they sequenced? What are the major categories for the skills that are on the standards? And so your conversation should address that question. And then the second question really is, what are some of the communication skills as you're reading through that you think are really important for the group of students you're working with? And so to be able to look at the standards and kind of, again, match with your students' situation and their communication skills and their needs. And so that's the conversation. The summarize, the end of the week, the summarize, each of you posts an example from your student. So you've done the P levels, you've identified goals, sort of broad goals. Well, this is the chart that you will use, and the summarizer, the person, is the one who's kind of in charge of making sure that everybody inserts their information, their example, and then posts it as the final post for summarize. But each person will insert the P-level skill that you identified last module, module 2. Find in the standards, so if it's Common Core, or it's the bilingual, or if it's the WEMLs, whichever one is the most appropriate and kind of matches with your students, their age and the expectations. Find a standard from one of those groups of standards that matches. Then think about just some ideas about where in the curriculum, where in the school day, where in academic conversations that particular skill associated with that standard, where it might be important for students to know and use that. And then again, this last column is for you to just think about, so how would you kind of monitor that? How would you know that the student is improving in terms of their use of the communication skill? And this chart is what the summarizer will post for summarize. And that's week 1. Then week 2, we go, we focus more on the apply is really, we're kind of focusing on teaching. So now we spent really a lot of time thinking about what are their goals. You get an opportunity to, again, really refine what your goal might be, thinking about how do you blend the P-level skill and what's expected in the curriculum, and can you begin to think about how to blend those into a really important goal and 2 benchmarks. So the goal is big, and then the benchmarks are the steps up to the goal. Think about what are the parts that you have to think about. Again, look at my example, because I kind of help give you some ideas about what that might look like. And then, so you read the chapter, which gives you ideas about teaching, and then write an IEP goal. We're kind of, again, refining and hopefully improving on our goal. And you think about how you write a goal again, kind of reminding you about measurable conditions and what are the criteria. And so I present you with a chart that really helps you think about the context, or where you might teach or support the development of that communication goal. And then on across the top is really your approach to teaching, or kind of how. And so I just want to, I'm going to kind of look at and explain a little bit more through my notes, because this is really the general process. We identified developmentally where the area and skills that we think are important developmentally for the student. Then I call them high mileage. Thinking about the skills that are really functional for learning. And so being able to pick out those really important ones. Believe me, you will have a lot of skills that you can work on. So you have to pick out the ones that are most important and really kind of focus on that. And then we hope that the other communication skills that the students need come along with that. So you kind of try and focus. And then we're kind of trying to align the skills that we think are important with the expectations, and those are the standards. And then to think about how to teach or situate where and how we teach those skills in school. So my notes kind of go over all of that. This is the chart that I wanted to point out. Kind of hard to see on 2 pages. No, this is the example of what you do for summarize. So it's the P-level goal and the expectations and the school curriculum, where you might teach it, and then how I might monitor it. Those are examples. And then this is the matrix that I want. Look better on one. All right, so this is sort of the way to think about instruction or teaching. And the first is to think about the context, where, who will be in that group. Are you going to do it teacher to student? Are you going to do it in a small group? Will you do it within the regular classroom? So you see the context keeps getting bigger and bigger. You start one-on-one, and then you move to a small group, and then you might move to the classroom. Maybe you start with the classroom. It just really depends on the context, where and with who you would be supporting this communication skill. And then across the top is really the approach. And so one approach or one way is to be very, very explicit. And so it's very focused, it's very direct. Your instruction is very direct, very focused, very specifically on the skill. And the second level is explicit but embedded within a content area. And so the third level then is fully embedded in the classroom and in the content. So you can see, if you look at the matrix, it gets more and more in a wider context in the regular classroom and more embedded in the academic curriculum. So this is the continuum. And so I want you to, in week 2, to think about, here's the skill, where and kind of how am I going to teach this? So if we go back to the apply second week, I do have a format for your activity, which I think really kind of explains the very end, what we really want to do for Module 3, and that is right here. So your student, what was their P level? Again, that was from Module 2. You're identifying an aligned standard that matches and somehow includes the P level skill that you want to teach. Create an IEP academic curriculum goal that really is on communication and matches what the student's communication need is with the curriculum. Again, we have 3 models: the Common Core State Standards, WEMLs, or the bilingual standards. Think of 2 benchmarks, again, beginning to kind of break it down so that you can think of, what do I need to do first, second, third to get to that goal? And then thinking back on the matrix, where you think about the context of instruction, where, with whom, and the approach, the general approach, and then finding a strategy from either your readings or from some other resource that you have, or something you have maybe seen before, that would be a really good strategy for teaching that goal. So it just kind of walks you through each step in the process for focusing on communication and planning. All right, so any questions, let me know. And Module 3, here we go.